Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dimly lit consulting room of a 19th century physician who has somehow convinced an entire civilization that the cure for a woman having opinions is a small brown bottle of tincture, a prolonged rest cure in a room with the curtains drawn, and, if things get really serious, a little light electricity applied to the temples. The patient is fine. The patient has always been fine. The patient simply made the mistake of expressing dissatisfaction with her husband in front of someone who owned a prescription pad. Tonight, we are exploring one of history's most elaborate, most medically credentialed, and most spectacularly misguided systems for managing the inconvenient inner lives of half the human population. It's dark. It's fascinating. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know. What ailment do you think a Victorian doctor would have diagnosed you with? Be honest. Excessive opinions? An alarming tendency to read? A constitution ill-suited to strong emotions? I want to know. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and get comfortable. Pull your blanket up, your perfectly ordinary, unmedicated blanket, and settle in. No one is going to prescribe you anything tonight. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered, what exactly did a 19th century doctor write in a woman's chart when he decided she was too emotional? Was there a technical term for wanting to leave your marriage? Did laudanum actually smell like anything? Or did it just quietly arrive and rearrange your afternoon? How many women were committed to asylums, not because they were mentally unwell, but because they were inconveniently correct? Was there a point where a woman could look her physician directly in the eye and say, "I believe you have invented this illness"? And if so, what happened next? Did the doctors believe their own diagnoses? Or did they go home, sit in a chair, and experience the mild private discomfort of a man who knows, on some level, what he's doing? And finally, because we have to ask, how many of the women prescribed arsenic for their complexion, mercury for their nerves, and morphine for their moods eventually outlived the men who prescribed it? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1875 in a moderately prosperous household somewhere in London, in a bedroom that smells of coal smoke, violet water, and the faint medicinal sweetness of whatever was in the bottle on the nightstand. The room is full of heavy curtains because your doctor has told you that natural light is bad for your nerves, which is a sentence no one has questioned out loud. Somewhere downstairs, a small dog named Pudding is barking at something it has decided to regard as a threat, and the sounds of the street outside, horses, vendors, the grinding optimism of the Victorian morning, are filtering through the velvet like signals from another planet. You have been prescribed rest. You've been prescribed quiet. You've been prescribed, it turns out, disappearance. Welcome to the age of medical management. Try not to feel anything too strongly. Let's set the scene. You're standing in a consulting room in 1875, and it is not what you were hoping for. The walls are a dark, authoritative green, the kind of green that says, "Science happens here," and every available surface is occupied by something that looks either important or faintly threatening. Glass jars with Latin labels, a set of scales with small brass weights, a skeleton hanging from a hook in the corner with the resigned posture of someone who has heard the speech before. The doctor's desk is enormous. His chair is enormous. The chair across from the desk, the chair where the patient sits, is smaller, lower, and angled very slightly upward, so that you must look up at the man behind the desk in order to make eye contact. This is not an accident. Nothing in this room is an accident. The doctor himself, let us call him Dr. Hartwell, though he had 1,000 names and one face across every decade of the 19th century, is in his 50s, well-fed in the manner of someone whose meals are prepared by other people, and sporting the kind of beard that Victorian men seem to grow as a secondary profession. He has a good reputation. He has a framed certificate on the wall and a published paper on the subject of female nervousness that 5 other men have read and one has cited approvingly. He is not a bad man, not in the conventional sense. He genuinely believes what he's about to tell you. He believes it because his professors believed it, and his professors believed it because the generation before them believed it. And somewhere at the beginning of that chain is a man who looked at a woman expressing frustration and thought, the problem is inside her. Everything, the jars, the scales, the smaller chair, has been built around that original, foundational, enormously convenient conclusion. You sit down. You describe fatigue, anxiety, a persistent dissatisfaction, an inability to feel enthusiasm for your daily activities. He listens with the expression of a man who has already formed his opinion, but is professionally required to perform consideration. He nods. He picks up his pen. You have, he tells you, a nervous constitution. You are suffering from neurasthenia, a condition of nervous exhaustion, or possibly hysteria, or possibly chlorosis, which is a form of anemia specific to young women that is named for the faint greenish tinge it supposedly produces in the skin, a symptom that, it should be noted, no one in recorded history has ever actually seen. He writes a prescription. It involves rest, isolation, mild sedation, and a reduction in intellectual stimulation. The skeleton in the corner says nothing. Pudding, the small dog, is still barking somewhere in the city, and you're holding a piece of paper that has just formally diagnosed you with having an inner life. Welcome to the consulting room. Hang your coat up. You're going to be here for a while. Let's talk about the authority figure, Dr. Hartwell, and again, he is every doctor, not just one, operates in an interesting position. He is the expert. He is the scientist. In a century that has made science its religion, he is also, in a meaningful sense, the priest. The Victorian medical establishment has inherited the church's old job of explaining and managing human experience, and it has approached this assignment with genuine enthusiasm and a quite spectacular absence of controls. The rules of the game, as Dr. Hartwell understands them, run roughly as follows. Men are rational beings with robust constitutions capable of withstanding the full range of emotional and intellectual experience. Women are different. Women are governed by their reproductive systems, specifically by what Victorian medicine delicately called the womb, and less delicately called the source of most of their problems. The womb, they believed, was in a state of more or less constant rebellion, sending disruptive signals to the brain, destabilizing the emotions, undermining the reason. Any symptom a woman presented, sadness, anger, boredom, anxiety, fatigue, insomnia, excessive talking, not enough talking, opinions about politics, opinions about her own household, could plausibly be traced back to the womb. This is, from a diagnostic standpoint, enormously convenient. It means that every symptom points to the same cause, and every cause points to the same treatment, and the treatment is always some version of settle down. Dr. Hartwell does not think of himself as a man in the business of control. He thinks of himself as a man in the business of health. He is genuinely concerned about his patient's welfare. He prescribes Laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, with the same unhurried confidence with which your current GP might recommend staying hydrated. He recommends bed rest with the authority of someone who has read extensively about bed rest. He occasionally, in more severe cases, recommends the rest cure, weeks or months of enforced inactivity, isolation from family, and a regime of overfeeding and massage administered by a nurse, not the patient herself, because the patient is not to be trusted to manage her own recovery. He also, and this is where the 19th century becomes genuinely interesting, corresponds regularly with other physicians, reads their papers, attends their lectures, and participates in a professional community that is collectively, painstakingly, building the intellectual scaffolding for everything he believes. They have conferences, they have journals, they have statistics, or what passed for statistics, numbers collected without controls, interpreted without rigor, published without skepticism. They have, in short, all the machinery of science applied to conclusions that were reached before anyone looked at any evidence. He adjusts his beard. He sets down his pen. He asks if you have been overexerting yourself intellectually. He asks, with genuine professional concern, whether you have been reading too much. And here's the thing that makes this century so specifically maddening and so specifically compelling. There were women in that consulting room who recognized exactly what was happening and said so, and were told, with great patience, with great authority, with great professional concern, that their suspicion that something was wrong was itself a symptom of something being wrong. You cannot win a game in which arguing with the rules is considered evidence that you need more rules. Welcome to Dr. Hartwell's consulting room. He means well. That's the worst part. Let's talk about the rules. The formal system of women's medicine in the 19th century was built on a surprisingly small number of core principles, which together managed to be both individually absurd and collectively catastrophic in the way of really well-designed systems. Think of it like a tax code written by people who had never paid taxes, which has somehow been granted the full authority of the law. The first principle is that the female body is fundamentally, constitutionally different from the male body in ways that require special medical management. Not just anatomically different, that would be reasonable, but philosophically different, emotionally different, structurally susceptible in ways that demand intervention. This was stated as fact in textbooks, in lectures, in the casual certainty of a profession that had not yet been asked to prove itself. The second principle is that intellectual activity is dangerous for women. This was not a fringe view. This was, in the 1870s and 1880s, a mainstream medical position, argued most influentially by a Harvard physician named Edward Clark, who published a book in 1873 called Sex in Education that argued women who studied too hard would damage their reproductive organs. The brain and the uterus, Clark believed, were in competition for energy, and if a woman directed too much energy toward thinking, her uterus would suffer. This was the kind of reasoning that passed peer review, because the peers doing the reviewing were also interested in the conclusion, sort of like asking people who own umbrellas whether it's going to rain. The third principle is that women's symptoms are best managed through rest, seclusion, and chemical intervention. And so the prescriptions followed logically. If you accept the logic, which is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting here: laudanum for anxiety, potassium bromide for agitation, chloral hydrate for insomnia, valerian for nerves, arsenic for anemia, which meant arsenic was also, incidentally, for pallor, fatigue, and lack of appetite, which meant that a significant portion of 19th century women were routinely consuming small amounts of poison as a health measure. This was not considered alarming. This was considered medicine. The fourth principle, and this is the one that makes the whole system lock into place, is that women who disagree with their diagnoses are demonstrating their diagnoses. A woman who protests that she is not nervous is being nervous. A woman who argues that she doesn't need rest is exhibiting the kind of agitation that necessitates rest. A woman who points out that her sadness is not a medical condition, but a rational response to a life that offers her very little control, is displaying a dangerous tendency toward morbid rumination that ought to be treated. It is, as designed systems go, quite efficient. Pudding the dog could have spotted the flaw in this. Pudding, to be fair, is more empirically minded than she appears. And yet, and here is where the story gets complicated in the way that history always does when you look long enough, many of the women inside this system found ways to work it, around it, or through it. They were not passive recipients of other people's decisions. They were people in a difficult situation, making difficult choices. And some of those choices were wily, and some were heartbreaking, and some were both. We will get to them. Welcome to the system. It makes perfect sense if you don't ask questions. Luckily, some people asked questions. Let's talk about the women. It would be a mistake to tell this story as though the women in it were invisible, which is precisely how the medical establishment preferred them. They were not invisible. They were, if anything, among the most interesting people in the room. And the room is full of interesting people, including Dr. Hartwell himself, who is unwittingly fascinating in the way that powerful people committed to wrong ideas always become fascinating in retrospect. Let us meet a few. There is Agnes, who appears in the records of a London asylum in 1882. She is 34 years old. She has been committed by her husband on the testimony of 2 physicians, neither of whom knew her before the week in question. Her offense, as best as can be reconstructed from the case notes, was a sustained and vocal refusal to stop expressing her views about her husband's management of their finances, combined with what one of the physicians described as an unsuitable fondness for argument. Agnes has dark eyes and a dry wit, and an extremely well-developed sense of exactly what is happening to her. She spends her first 3 weeks in the asylum explaining this with great precision to anyone who will listen. She is noted in the records as persuasive in a manner indicative of underlying mania. She eventually stops explaining it, not because she has stopped understanding it, but because she has figured out that the explaining is being used against her. And Agnes is above all a practical woman. She takes up embroidery. The embroidery is described by the staff as a sign of improvement. Agnes does not tell them what she thinks of that. Then there is Charlotte, who is not in an asylum, but in her own very comfortable home in Bath, which is a nicer prison and a colder one. Charlotte is 28. She has been prescribed the rest cure by a physician who has read Silas Weir Mitchell and considers him the foremost authority on female nervous exhaustion, which is fair enough because Mitchell is extraordinarily confident about female nervous exhaustion, and confidence often reads as expertise. Charlotte is not allowed to read. She is not allowed to write. She is not allowed to receive visitors for the first month. She is fed large meals 4 times a day. She is massaged by a nurse. She lies in a room with the curtains mostly drawn, staring at a ceiling she has memorized to a degree that she will remember in detail for the rest of her life. She is very bright, which her doctor considers part of the problem. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And yes, we are talking about Charlotte Perkins Gilman because this particular part of the story is too real and too important to leave in the third person. Will recover from this rest cure eventually, and she will write about it. She will write a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper that uses the rest cure as its setting and turns it inside out until it screams. It'll become one of the most important pieces of American literature about women and medicine. Mitchell, the doctor who prescribed the cure and inspired the story, will never really understand why. That is its own kind of punchline. And then there is Eliza, who is not famous, who will never be famous, who bought a small bottle of Godfrey's cordial from the chemist for her infant's colic in 1861 and did not know that Godfrey's cordial was primarily composed of laudanum, and that laudanum was primarily composed of opium, and that the reason her infant stopped crying was not actually the resolution of the colic. Eliza is not a villain in this story. She is a mother trying to manage an impossible situation with the tools she was given. And the tools she was given were made of opium. And no one thought this was worth mentioning clearly on the bottle. Agnes, Charlotte, Eliza. They don't know each other. They share an era, a social system, and a medical philosophy that has organized itself around managing their inner lives. They are, and the word is chosen carefully, patients. People who are patient, people who wait, who endure, who find, in their different ways, in their different rooms, in their different silences, the particular kind of strength that comes from being underestimated for a very long time. Welcome to their world. We'll be spending some time here. Don't worry. Pudding is around somewhere, investigating something warm. Let's talk about laudanum. Laudanum is where this story gets its texture, its color, its particular 19th-century smell, which is sweet and slightly medicinal, and underneath the sweetness, a little like something damp has been kept too long in the dark. It is the drug of the era, the one that sits in the corner of every scene, like a piece of furniture, present, unremarkable, and quietly reshaping everything around it. Laudanum is tincture of opium. It is opium dissolved in alcohol, which means it is 2 drugs for the price of one, which the Victorians considered excellent value. It was legal, it was cheap, it was available at every chemist and in most general stores. In the 1860s, you could buy it by the pound. Children's formulas, Godfrey's cordial, Dalby's carminative, McMunn's elixir, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, contained enough opium to sedate a small adult and were sold to mothers as a normal part of infant care. The recommended dose for a fussing baby was a teaspoon, which contained roughly 2 milligrams of morphine equivalent, which is a phrase that has no business appearing in a sentence about baby medicine. But here we are. For women, specifically, laudanum occupied a role that can only be described as socially useful. It smoothed the edges. It took the pitch out of the voice. It made what was intolerable feel bearable, and what was bearable feel acceptable, and what was simply her life feel for an hour or two, like a distant concern belonging to someone else. A woman prescribed laudanum for her nerves was a woman whose opinions had been chemically reduced. She might still have opinions. The opinions are not destroyed. They're just underwater, looking up through the glass. But she would express them more quietly, more slowly, with less force. She would require less management. This is not a conspiracy. This is something more interesting than a conspiracy. This is a system that has figured out what it needs and arranged itself to produce that outcome without any single person deciding that the outcome is what they want. Dr. Hartwell does not sit at his desk and think, I need her quieter. He thinks, she is in distress. This will help. And he is not entirely wrong. It does help, in the short term, the way that putting a pillow over an alarm clock helps with the problem of the alarm clock. The alarm clock does not think of this as a solution. Meanwhile, the chemist sells it cheerfully, in pretty bottles with paper labels, and the newspapers carry advertisements promising relief from female complaints, nervous exhaustion, palpitations, melancholy, and those troubles peculiar to women, which is a phrase doing a lot of work. The advertisements feature drawn illustrations of women reclining with expressions of tranquil bliss, which is either the effect of the product or a representation of the desired outcome, or possibly both. The dependency that followed was noted, discussed, and then managed by prescribing something else, chloral hydrate, perhaps, which arrived in 1869 and was greeted as a sleeping agent with none of laudanum's drawbacks, which was true in the same way that replacing one structural problem with a different structural problem could be called an improvement, or potassium bromide, which reduced agitation the way a very large stone reduces agitation, by simply making it impossible to function at the usual speed. Or morphine, which became much easier to deliver after the hypodermic needle was refined in the 1850s and could now be injected directly, which is a level of efficiency that the 19th century brought to several things it perhaps should not have. Eliza notices that the bottle on her nightstand is running lower than it used to. She orders another. The chemist doesn't ask questions. The system produces what the system requires, and the system runs quite smoothly. And putting the dog has found something in the kitchen that may or may not be related to dinner. And outside the window, the Victorian city goes about its efficient, coal-smoked, extraordinarily confident business. Let's talk about hysteria. The word needs a moment. It is a word that has carried a lot of weight across a lot of centuries, and the weight has not been evenly distributed. Hysteria comes from the Greek hystera, which means uterus, and this tells you everything you need to know about where the Greeks thought the problem lived. By the 19th century, hysteria had evolved. Intime, if evolved is the right word, which it possibly isn't, into a diagnosis of almost beautiful uselessness. It could explain any symptom in a woman, and it required no physical evidence, and it was definitionally resistant to disproof, because any woman who questioned her diagnosis was exhibiting the very instability the diagnosis was documenting. The symptom list for hysteria was, by the standards of medical literature, entertainingly comprehensive. You could be diagnosed with hysteria for fainting, for laughing too much, for crying too much, for laughing and crying at the same time, which is not a symptom so much as a Tuesday, for a tendency to wander, for excessive affection, for excessive coldness, for refusing to eat or eating too enthusiastically, for being sexually unresponsive, or for being sexually interested, the latter of which was considered distinctly alarming, for reading novels, for expressing political opinions, for refusing to express political opinions in a way that seemed pointed, for grief, for anger, for the kind of quiet, sustained unhappiness that any sensible person would feel in circumstances that offered almost no autonomy, almost no intellectual outlet, and almost no recourse. The treatment for hysteria, at various points in the 19th century, included bed rest, isolation, cold baths, warm baths, electric shocks to the spine, electric shocks to the abdomen, dietary restriction, dietary overloading, sedation, and the one that has become most notorious in subsequent retellings, though historians of medicine are careful to note, its scope has been overstated: pelvic massage performed by physicians, which produced what the medical literature called hysterical paroxysm, and which a person in 2026 would recognize by a more direct name. Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the foremost neurologist in France and ran a famous clinic at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, turned hysteria into something between a medical specialty and a theatrical event. He held public demonstrations of hysterical patients, lectures at which women were put into hypnotic states, and performed, before an audience of physicians and interested observers, the various attitudes passionnelles that Charcot had catalogued and named. The audiences were large. The women had names, but were usually referred to by numbers. The photographs are still around. If you look at them, you see women in poses of theatrical extremity, arched backwards, arms extended, expressions of either ecstasy or agony or something in between, while men in dark suits stand at the periphery of the frame, observing with professional detachment. What Charcot's patients were actually doing, later scholarship suggests, is performing. Not consciously, not conspiratorially, but in the way that people in high-pressure situations with limited power learn very quickly what is expected of them and produce it. The women at the Salpêtrière had figured out what made Charcot interested and what made him not interested, and the human brain, even a brain being diagnosed as pathologically unstable, is very good at figuring out what the person with power wants to see. This is a fairly elegant survival strategy wrapped in a medical tragedy. Charcot died in 1893. The women at the Salpêtrière mostly recovered once the theatrical environment was removed. which tells you something about where the hysteria had actually been living. Agnes, in her London asylum, has heard of Charcot. She is not performing. She is doing embroidery, methodically, in small, precise stitches, and thinking about someone that she will not share with the nursing staff. Let's talk about the daily routine. You wake up? Well, you are woken up, because the nurse has a schedule, and the schedule is not negotiable. At 7. The curtains remain drawn. Dr. Hartwell has specified that morning light is stimulating to the nerves, and stimulation is the enemy of recovery. And so your day begins in a dim room that smells of whatever was in the air last night. Coal smoke, violet water, and underneath it, faintly, the sweet medicine smell of the bottle on the nightstand. Breakfast arrives. It is large, because Silas Weir Mitchell, the American physician who developed the rest cure and published it widely enough that it became a transatlantic standard, believed that the exhausted female nervous system needed rebuilding through nutrition. The meal is typically eggs, bread, warm milk, possibly a small piece of meat, all delivered on a tray that you eat in bed. You have no say in the menu. You have no say in the portion. The idea is that the nurse will oversee the eating because the nervous system cannot be trusted to regulate its own appetite. This is the kind of logic that, once you accept the premises, follows inevitably and produces something that has all the external characteristics of kindness and all the internal characteristics of a very polite siege. After breakfast, the nurse massages your limbs. This was meant to replace the circulation benefits of exercise, which you are not permitted to take. The massage is clinical, thorough, and performed by someone following a procedure rather than comforting another person. It is, depending on the quality of the nurse, either neutral or profoundly alienating. You are not supposed to have feelings about it. The nurse notes your responses in a small book. Then you rest. Then there's lunch, also large. Then you rest. Then, in the late afternoon, if the doctor has authorized it, you may be read to by the nurse. Simple material, nothing taxing, nothing with themes that might produce agitation. Religious texts were popular, nature writing, accounts of other people's travels, which is a choice that in retrospect seems designed to produce the very restlessness it was meant to soothe. Then dinner, smaller, and then more rest, and then sleep, ideally with the assistance of something in a small bottle. The purpose of this routine, stated plainly in Mitchell's own writing, is to remove the patient from all decision-making, all responsibility, all intellectual engagement, until her nervous system has had time to recover. The patient is, in essence, returned to a state of managed infancy, fed, bathed, moved, put to sleep, observed. The presumption is that her own mind has been making her sick and must therefore be disarmed. What is never quite addressed is how, at the end of all this rest, the woman is to return to the life that produced the exhaustion in the first place, without the life having changed in any meaningful way. Charlotte, in her curtain-dimmed room, is thinking about this. She has a great deal of time to think about it, because there is nothing else to do, and the irony of being forbidden to think while having nothing else to do is not lost on her. It is not lost on her at all. The yellow wallpaper on the ceiling is starting to form patterns. She is not going to tell the nurse. Pudding has been allowed into the room once, briefly, and found Charlotte's hand with her nose, and it was, Charlotte decides, the best moment of the last 3 weeks. Let's talk about the food. The Victorian physician's dietary recommendations for nervous women occupy a special place in the history of medical advice, which is a history that also includes bleeding as a treatment for fever and mercury as a cure for syphilis. So the competition is stiff, but the dietary recommendations hold their own. The rest cures overfeeding protocol, which Charlotte is currently experiencing and finding wearing in ways she is not allowed to express, was based on Mitchell's theory that nervous exhaustion was partly a problem of insufficient body mass. His patients were to gain weight, not a little weight, a lot. Mitchell documented cases in which patients gained 30 or 40 pounds during a rest cure, which he recorded with satisfaction as evidence of improvement. The fact that the patients were not pleased about this was interpreted as further evidence of the nervous disorder, because a woman in good health would surely understand that her doctor knows what's good for her. Meanwhile, outside the rest cure ward, the general dietary advice for women with nervous complaints ran in the opposite direction. Light food, easily digested, nothing too stimulating. Meat was sometimes restricted on the grounds that it excited the passions. Strong tea was alarming. Coffee was worse. Wine, interestingly, was frequently considered acceptable in small amounts because the physicians liked it and had arranged their guidelines accordingly. The actual daily food of most women in this era, wealthy or not, was worse than this makes it sound. Bread was often adulterated with chalk, alum, or plaster of Paris to make it whiter and heavier. Milk was frequently watered down and sometimes preserved with formaldehyde. Butter might contain lard, tallow, or the ground bones of whatever was available. Jam was sweetened with lead salts in some manufacturing operations. The food safety laws that would eventually address this were decades away. And in the meantime, the answer to, "Why do I feel unwell?" was frequently nervous constitution, rather than "you ate something with formaldehyde in it." Patent medicines filled the gap. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which advertised itself as a cure for all female complaints and was approximately 18 to 20% alcohol by volume, was one of the most popular. Mrs. Pinkham herself was a real person, a Massachusetts entrepreneur who developed the formula in the 1870s and marketed it with genuine commercial genius, including the famous innovation of putting her own face on the label and inviting women to write to her with their complaints. After her death, the company continued to print replies to these letters over her signature for decades, which is a practice that has aged quite poorly. The compound was also just over a fifth alcohol, which meant that temperance women who publicly opposed liquor were sometimes medicating themselves with something that would have gotten them removed from a saloon, and this situation was understood by approximately everyone and commented on by approximately no one. There was also Humphrey's homeopathic specifics, and Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people, and Carter's little liver pills, and Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, and perhaps most pointedly named of all, Payne's celery compound, which combined celery, genuinely soothing, no complaints, with alcohol, various herbs, and an unspecified quantity of opium. These products did not cure anything. They managed symptoms. Sometimes they managed symptoms very effectively, in the way that not being able to feel your face manages a headache. Eliza has several of them in her cabinet. She doesn't think of it as self-medication. She thinks of it as managing. Pudding has knocked something off the kitchen shelf. Eliza replaces it without looking too closely at what it was. Let's talk about the hygiene. Medical hygiene in the 19th century is a subject that rewards a certain kind of dark enthusiasm, and the experience of being a female patient in this era rewards it especially. The operating theaters, when a woman graduated to the level of requiring surgery, were not sterile environments. Antisepsis as a practice was only slowly gaining acceptance across this period, and there were still surgeons performing operations in the same unwashed coat they had worn for years, on the grounds that the blood stains were a mark of experience. Germ theory was new enough to be controversial. A physician who believed in washing his hands between patients was still, in the early decades of this period, something of an eccentric. For women with specifically female complaints, meaning anything related to their reproductive systems, the medical options included an array of procedures whose names are clinical, but whose realities require a moment. Ovariotomy, or the surgical removal of ovaries, was performed for an astonishing range of conditions: intractable epilepsy, excessive masturbation, insanity, moral deviance, and persistent failure to be content with one's circumstances. The physician Robert Batty, who developed the procedure in the United States in 1872, called it normal ovariotomy and believed it could cure a variety of female nervous conditions. It was performed on thousands of women. Some of his colleagues were skeptical. Most, initially, were not. The non-surgical treatments were less alarming in their specifics and sometimes more alarming in their duration. Douches of various chemical compositions were prescribed. Devices of various configurations were applied or inserted. Electric current was passed through the pelvic region, through the spine, and occasionally through the head, because the medical establishment of the 19th century found electricity thoroughly exciting and applied it, with the enthusiasm of people who have discovered a new ingredient to approximately every condition that did not respond immediately to everything else. Daily bathing was, during most of this period, not a universal practice. The Victorian fear of cold, combined with the logistical difficulty of hot water, meant that full baths were weekly events for most households, and luxury events for many. Sponge baths in cold water were the standard. Hair washing was even less frequent, because the prevailing wisdom held that wet hair on a nervous constitution was risky. The hair was instead cleaned with dry substances, powders, sometimes vinegar, and pinned up into the elaborate structures that characterized the era, which took considerable time and produced the specific sensation of wearing a small architectural project on your head. Personal medical products for women included menstrual rags. Disposable commercial sanitary products would not arrive until the 1880s and would not be widely used until much later. And a range of pessaries, tonics, and binding garments of considerable rigidity. The corset, which has been discussed to near exhaustion in every historical survey of Victorian women, but cannot be left out here because it is medically relevant. It compressed the organs, restricted breathing, and produced in habitual wearers a genuine physiological deformity of the lower ribs. It also, depending on the physician, either caused female nervous complaints or cured them. Several physicians prescribed tighter lacing as a treatment for hysteria. Several others blamed tight lacing for hysteria. This disagreement was conducted, largely, by men who did not wear corsets, about bodies that were not their own, with great confidence and very few controls. Agnes has a theory about the corset. She's embroidering it, slowly and precisely, into a small square of linen. Let's talk about what got you committed. The line between a nervous complaint treated at home and a nervous complaint treated in an institution was, in the 19th century, less a line than a general region, and where you fell within that region depended partly on your symptoms and much more on the people around you. Specifically, on whether the people around you had financial or social motivation to put you somewhere that was not their house. The Lunacy Act of 1845 in Britain established the legal framework for commitment, which required a certificate from a medical man and an order from a justice of the peace or a family member. In practice, the certificate could be obtained from a physician who had met the patient once, briefly, under circumstances not representative of her usual state. The family order could be signed by a husband, who also managed all legal and financial affairs, and was therefore the person with the most direct interest in the outcome. This was not considered a conflict of interest, because the law was written by men who found the concept of a wife's legal independence fairly theoretical. The grounds for commitment were capacious, insane, lunatic, or of unsound mind were the legal categories, and the evidence that could fill them included screaming, refusing to eat, eating too much, expressing delusions, expressing beliefs about one's husband that the husband found objectionable, spending money irresponsibly, as judged by the husband who controlled the money, or a failure to perform the duties of a wife and mother in a satisfactory manner. A woman who drank too much could be committed. A woman who accused her husband of affairs could be committed. A woman who appeared in public in a state of emotional distress could be committed. And the emotional distress could have been produced by the process of being taken to the institution, which means the commitment process was both the response to and the cause of the evidence it required. Georgina Weldon is perhaps the most famous British example. A real woman who in 1882 escaped a commitment order signed by her husband through an extraordinary series of maneuvers, a lucky warning from a friend, and the physical act of running out of her house before the doctors arrived. She then spent years suing everyone involved, quite successfully, and represented herself in court. She was described by the press as either heroic or a nuisance, depending on the editorial position of the newspaper, and possibly both. Georgina Weldon is not one of our named characters, but she deserves a mention, because she is what happened when a woman had the resources, the connections, and the absolute furious determination to fight back. And even she barely made it out. Agnes, in her London asylum, has read about Georgina Weldon. Agnes has no equivalent resources. Agnes has her embroidery and her considerable intelligence and a great deal of patience, which is, under the circumstances, the tool she has to work with. Now, let's talk about the medicines themselves. Really talk about them. because the story of what was prescribed is not just a story about sedation or control. It is also a story about what happens when a pharmacopoeia is built around the needs of a system rather than the needs of the people inside it, and what the people inside it did with the chemicals they were given. Laudanum we have met. Morphine we have mentioned. Chloral hydrate arrived in 1869, as noted, and was considered a cleaner, safer sleep aid, which was true in the specific sense that it didn't cause constipation, and false in the sense that it was also a central nervous system depressant with significant dependency potential. It was the drug in Sherlock Holmes's era that people who wanted to look sophisticated at parties referred to. It was also what dissolved the intellectual capacity of a generation of women who were being given it for nerves, insomnia, and the general condition of finding their lives difficult to sustain. Potassium bromide, widely used from the 1850s onward, was a sedative and anticonvulsant that worked by generally suppressing neurological excitability. In practical terms, this meant it made you slower, duller, less likely to reach emotional peaks in either direction. For women prescribed it for hysteria or excessive emotion. The result was a kind of emotional flattening that looked from the outside like recovery. The patient was calmer. She spoke more slowly. She seemed less distressed. Her husband found her easier to be around. Her doctor noted improvement. What the medication had not done, of course, was address any of the circumstances that had produced the original distress. It had simply made her less capable of registering them. Arsenic is the one that takes you a moment to believe. But there it is. Arsenic was a widely used medicine across the 19th century and into the 20th, prescribed for anemia, for skin complaints, for malaria, for the improvement of the complexion. Fowler's solution, a 1% solution of potassium arsenite, was available at any chemist, prescribed by physicians, taken for years, and did produce certain cosmetic effects, including a pallid, translucent skin quality that was fashionable in the period. It also slowly poisoned the users, producing over years the characteristic symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning: skin lesions, peripheral neuropathy, liver damage, increased cancer risk. But it was affordable. It was legal. It was prescribed by qualified physicians, and it made you look, temporarily, like the portraits on the walls. Eliza doesn't take this one. She has enough bottles already. And then there is cannabis, which appears in the Victorian pharmacopoeia in the form of cannabis indica tincture, an import from India that entered British and American medicine in the 1840s through the work of William O'Shaughnessy, who had observed its use during his time in India and brought back samples. It was prescribed for pain, for spasms, for insomnia, and for mental uneasiness, which is the period's way of saying anxiety without committing to a specific cause. Unlike the opiates, it was not known to be fatally addictive. Unlike the bromides, it did not produce profound cognitive flattening. For some women, it was likely the most functional of all the prescribed options, which is either hopeful or not hopeful at all, depending on how you look at it. There was also cocaine, which entered medical use in the 1880s after Karl Kohler discovered its use as a local anesthetic, and Freud published enthusiastically about its potential as a treatment for morphine addiction. Freud was wrong about this, and was also a cocaine user himself, which the history of medicine has had ample time to consider. Cocaine was an ingredient in Vin Mariani, a wine endorsed by Queen Victoria, Thomas Edison, and Pope Leo XIII, who gave it a gold medal. It was also an ingredient in the original formulation of a carbonated soft drink the audience will immediately recognize, which quietly removed its cocaine in 1903 and continues to sponsor sporting events with an enthusiasm that makes more historical sense now. Charlotte is not using any of these. Charlotte is lying in her room, staring at the ceiling, and the wallpaper is doing something she can't quite explain. And the only thing she has been given is milk. Let's talk about the physicians who started to ask questions. Because here is the thing about a system that produces outcomes this specific. Eventually, someone notices. Not everyone. Not quickly. Not with the force that would be needed to change things in the short term. But somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, a small number of people, and many of them were also women, because women had noticed from the beginning, started to examine the premises. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849 from Geneva Medical College in New York, which admitted her in a vote that the male students treated as a joke, expecting her to refuse, and which she did not refuse. She then had to do her clinical training in Europe because American hospitals would not accept her. She eventually founded her own medical school in New York, specifically to train women as physicians, on the slightly radical premise that women might have useful perspectives on the medical care of other women. She also, in her practice, pushed back against the idea that female nervousness was a constitutional characteristic of the female body, arguing instead that it was the product of unhealthy conditions, poor ventilation, insufficient exercise, inadequate education, social constraints that produced a kind of existential stagnation. She was considered provocative by most of her colleagues. She kept going. Then there is Mary Putnam Jacobi, who is even less famous than she ought to be. Jacobi was an American physician trained partly in Paris, where she was the first woman admitted to the École de Médecine. She returned to the United States, practiced medicine, and, in 1876, submitted an essay to Harvard's Boylston Prize competition, which was awarded for the best essay on a specified medical question. The question that year concerned the question of whether women should rest during menstruation, a standard Victorian recommendation based on the belief that menstruation was a pathological state requiring careful management. Jacobi's essay argued, using data she had collected herself, that menstruation was a normal physiological process, that resting during it was unnecessary and in many cases counterproductive, and that the entire framework of female rest was not supported by evidence. The essay won the prize. The committee apparently did not know she was a woman when they awarded it. They found out afterward. The prize stood. These women are doing what Agnes is doing, in her way, in her very different circumstances. They are working within a system that wasn't built for them, using the tools available toward a destination that the system officially regards as unnecessary. And there was also John Stuart Mill, who is not a physician, but is a philosopher, and one of the most prominent public voices in 1860s, Britain, arguing that the subjection of women is both empirically indefensible and morally catastrophic. His wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, had argued this more forcefully before him, and his daughter, Helen Taylor, after him, and he credited both openly, which in the context of Victorian public life qualifies as a fairly substantial gesture. His 1869 essay, The Subjection of Women, argued that the characteristics attributed to women by nature, irrationality, emotional excess, constitutional unsuitability for intellectual engagement, were in fact the products of centuries of conditioning and confinement, and that an accurate assessment of women's capacities would require a world in which they had actually been permitted to develop them. This argument was not new. Mary Wollstonecraft had made it in 1792. Various women had been making versions of it continuously in the intervening decades. Mill made it loudly, in public, with a reputation that made it harder to dismiss, and it was still dismissed by most of the medical establishment, who had their own papers and their own Hartwell reasoning, and their own system that worked exactly the way it was supposed to work and produced exactly the outcomes it was designed to produce. Still, the questions had been asked. They were in the air now, the way that uncomfortable questions always eventually get into the air, mixed in with the coal smoke and the violet water and the smell of pudding. Who is settled near Agnes's chair and is sleeping with the profound moral unconcern of a dog who does not know about the history of medicine. Let's talk about the social danger. What was the actual risk of non-compliance? What happened to a woman who simply declined to be managed? The answer depended enormously on her position. A wealthy woman with a sympathetic husband and no living male relatives with competing financial interests could, in practice, decline her physician's recommendations without serious consequence. She might be considered eccentric. Her doctor might shake his head. She would continue to exist as herself, which is perhaps all she was asking for. A woman without those protections was in a different situation. A woman whose husband controlled her finances, which, until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 in Britain, all women were, legally, because all property in a marriage belonged to the husband, had no independent resources with which to seek second opinions, employ her own physician, or leave a situation she found medically dangerous. She could not sue. She could not sign contracts. She could not, without her husband's cooperation, access her own money. She was, legally, a dependent, and a dependent who objects loudly to the terms of her dependence is in a structurally weak negotiating position. A woman who refused her prescribed treatment was exhibiting symptoms. A woman who argued with her physician was exhibiting symptoms. A woman who refused the rest cure could be told that her refusal indicated the severity of her condition, which was, of course, exactly the diagnosis that justified the rest cure. The loop is not accidental. The specific risks of public noncompliance included social censure, manageable if unpleasant, family pressure, less manageable, medical escalation, from tinctures to stronger interventions, and in extreme cases, the commitment that Agnes has already met on our behalf. Between those extremes, there were smaller punishments and social costs. A woman considered difficult was also a woman considered unwell, and a woman considered unwell was also a woman whose opinions were not quite trustworthy. And a woman whose opinions were not quite trustworthy was a woman who could be managed on the grounds that she needed managing, and who could be further medicated on the grounds that she was too distressed to make good decisions about her own medication. Charlotte, in her room, knows all of this. She has read enough. She has thought enough. She is going to get better and get out and write about it. And writing about it will be her refusal, conducted at a distance where the cure cannot touch her. Agnes, in her asylum, is embroidering. She has decided that patience is not the same as acceptance, and that the difference between these two things is the most important territory she will ever defend. Eliza is giving her infant another spoonful of Godfrey's cordial because the infant is crying and she doesn't know what else to do. And the bottle says, "It is safe." Let's talk about the human connection. In a story this full of systems and structures and rooms with drawn curtains, it would be easy to overlook the fact that human beings found each other inside all of it, that they did what human beings do, even in conditions specifically designed to prevent them, which is make friends, fall in love, build small warm spaces inside cold situations, and find the particular humor that lives only in very dark places. The women in Victorian institutions were not socially isolated from each other, whatever the official purpose of their confinement. They shared wards, common rooms, gardens. They knew each other's names and histories. They borrowed books when books were available. They told each other things they couldn't tell the nursing staff. In the asylums, and the asylums were large, the Salpêtrière alone housed several hundred women. There were communities, alliances, small economies of favor and information. Agnes has made two friends. One is a woman named Ruth, who is 42, who was committed for what her husband described as violent and unreasonable behavior, and what Ruth describes as, "I threw his breakfast at him, yes, and I will tell you exactly why if you have an hour." Ruth is large and deliberate and laughs at roughly twice the frequency of most people, and has decided, with characteristic practicality, that if she is here, she is here, and she intends to be comfortable. She has negotiated the nurses into a slightly more reasonable arrangement about outdoor time. She is Agnes's primary source of news about the institution's politics. The other friend is Eleanor, who is 26, who came in quietly and has stayed quietly, and is the only person in the ward who the staff considers entirely calm and docile, which is because Eleanor's particular coping strategy is invisibility, and she is very good at it. Eleanor reads everything she can access, remembers everything she reads, and has an opinion on all of it that she shares with Agnes and Ruth in low voices when the nurses are at the other end of the room. These three women in their ward, with their limited resources and their considerable intelligence and their various prescriptions and their one small window overlooking a garden where something has interested pudding, or a dog very like pudding. These stories are sometimes generous with geography, have built something that looks from the outside like patient compliance and is from the inside like an independent country with its own government. And yet, the warmth of this is real. The humor of this is real. The fact that human beings can do this, can construct community out of enforced proximity, can find each other even when found, can be both imprisoned and entirely themselves simultaneously, is one of the things this history keeps saying, underneath everything else. The system was designed to produce isolated, manageable individuals. It produced, instead, Agnes and Ruth and Eleanor, who are embroidering and arguing and reading in low voices. And that is, in any era, a form of resistance that doesn't require a name to be a fact. Let's talk about the rest cure. Silas Weir Mitchell, who designed it, was an American physician who practiced in Philadelphia, who was also a published novelist, and who had, by the 1880s, become the foremost authority on nervous exhaustion in the United States and an influential voice in Britain. His patients were famous. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whom he told to live as domestic a life as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and to never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as you live. Jane Addams, the social reformer, was also his patient. Virginia Woolf's doctors prescribed her a version of the rest cure, administered by her husband Leonard, about which she had complicated feelings that she expressed through the creation of multiple novels in which female interiority is treated with extraordinary seriousness, which is not exactly what Mitchell had in mind. The rest cure worked like this. The patient was removed from her home and her family and taken to either a clinic or a rented room, depending on her finances. She was confined to bed for 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer. She was fed large meals. She was massaged. She was read to, if reading was allowed that week. She was prohibited from receiving visitors, especially female friends and family, on the grounds that these were stimulating and exciting to the nerves. She was not allowed to write. She was not allowed to make decisions. She was not allowed to, in Mitchell's own words, lead the life of a semi-invalid. The cure, in its stated form, had a logic. Mitchell believed that his patients were often educated, high-achieving women caught between intellectual ambitions and social restrictions that meant those ambitions had almost nowhere to go, who had exhausted themselves through overwork and needed to rebuild their physical reserves. He was not wrong that his patients were often exhausted. He was catastrophically wrong about why. What he was actually treating was the predictable consequence of asking a human being to live a half-life, to be intelligent enough to understand her situation, educated enough to see what she was missing, and constrained enough that none of that intelligence or education could actually be used. His patients were not suffering from an excess of activity. They were suffering from an insufficiency of it. They were not overstimulated. They were desperately bored in the specific existential way that only very capable people who are not permitted to use their capabilities can be bored. And the rest cure, which stripped away every remaining mechanism of self-expression and agency, made this worse. Charlotte Perkins Gilman got better after she left the rest cure and went back to writing. This is not a coincidence. She wrote the Yellow Wallpaper specifically to tell Mitchell what his cure had done to her. He reportedly said, later in life, that the story had changed his treatment of one patient, which is a sentence that can be read either as encouraging or as the absolute minimum possible response to a published literary indictment. Let's talk about what they dreamed of: the escape fantasy. Every chapter of this kind of history has one. What the people inside the system imagined when they let themselves imagine. Agnes has hers. Charlotte has hers. Eliza has something quieter, more domestic, a fantasy not of escape exactly, but of a life slightly different from this one. A life where the bottle on the shelf is not something she needs. For many women in this era, The fantasy was education. The expansion of women's education in the latter half of the 19th century. Girton College at Cambridge opened in 1869, Newnham in 1871. Women's colleges at Oxford were established in 1878 and 1879. The medical schools began to admit women, reluctantly, and then eventually created a specific group of women who had been given enough education to see clearly and not enough permission to use what they saw. These were the women who filled Mitchell's waiting rooms, according to Mitchell himself, who noted the phenomenon with genuine puzzlement. His patients were often the most educated women he treated, and somehow the education seemed to make them worse. He concluded this was evidence that education was bad for women. Other conclusions were available. For other women, the fantasy was property. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882, passed after decades of campaigning, meant that women could own property in their own name after marriage, could keep their own earnings, could enter contracts, could not have their assets simply absorbed by their husbands on the wedding day. This was described by some opponents at the time as a threat to the family, and by some physicians as likely to produce nervous complications in women unprepared for the responsibility of financial independence. The women who campaigned for it described it as the minimum necessary condition for being a person. For others still, the fantasy was the vote, which was coming but had not arrived. British women would not vote on equal terms with men until 1928, American women until 1920, and in both cases, the arrival followed decades of protest, civil disobedience, force-feeding of hunger strikers, and a sustained national argument conducted in the specific key of men explaining that women were too emotional to manage the vote. An argument that the history of the suffragette movement has rendered permanently self-undermining. And for some women, and this is the most private, most human version of the fantasy, what they wanted was simply an afternoon to sit somewhere without being observed, without being managed, without being scheduled, without being prescribed. An afternoon in which they were the sole authority over what they were thinking, what they were reading, whether they were resting or not, whether they were eating or not, whether they were feeling or not. An afternoon of ordinary autonomy, which is something so unremarkable to the person reading this in their comfortable bed in 2026 that it barely registers as a thing to want, and which was, for a great many women across a great deal of this history, a genuinely radical aspiration. Agnes finishes a section of her embroidery. It is small and precise, and the stitching is very good. She starts another section. Let's talk about the doctors who profited, because this is also a story about money, and no story about medicine is fully honest if it doesn't talk about money. Because the shape of what gets diagnosed and what gets treated and what gets prescribed tends to follow, at some distance, the shape of what generates income. The Victorian nerve doctor, the specialist in female nervous complaints, occupied a financially enviable position. His patients were, by definition, chronic. Nervous exhaustion was not a condition that resolved itself over a course of antibiotics. It required ongoing management, ongoing consultation, ongoing prescription. A woman diagnosed with hysteria in 1870 might be managing her condition, which is to say, being managed for years or decades. The physician saw her regularly. The druggist refilled her prescriptions regularly. The nursing home or rest cure clinic charged by the week. The system was, financially, a perpetual motion machine that produced money as reliably as it produced sedated, isolated women. Patent medicine manufacturers occupied an even more lucrative position. Lydia Pinkham's compound, at its peak in the 1880s and 1890s, was one of the best-selling patent medicines in the United States. Its advertising was extraordinary for its time, targeted specifically to women, featuring testimonials from satisfied customers, promising relief from the full range of female complaints, and carrying an implicit message that a woman's health was her own responsibility and could be managed privately, without a physician. This was both liberating and exploitative, which is a combination the 19th century managed quite well. The advertising copy for female remedies of this era is a historical document of sustained creative achievement. Restore the delicate feminine system to its natural balance. Soothe the overwrought nerves of modern womanhood. For those peculiar ailments which afflict only the refined and sensitive. A friend in the consulting room of every home. These advertisements understood their audience. They understood that the women reading them were looking for something the official medical system was not providing. Acknowledgement that they felt unwell, and a solution that did not require a male physician to validate their experience. They provided both at a price with varying sincerity. The 18% alcohol was not always listed on the label. Meanwhile, the manufacturers of chloral hydrate, potassium bromide, laudanum, and the various proprietary preparations containing them were doing excellent business. The pharmaceutical industry of the 19th century was not yet regulated. The Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States didn't arrive until 1906, and even then, it did not immediately require the disclosure of all active ingredients or accurate labeling of quantities. In Britain, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 restricted the sale of certain poisons, including arsenic and opium, but this did not apply to patent medicines containing these substances in lower concentrations, which continued to be freely sold. The gap between what was in the bottle and what was on the label was wide enough to drive a horse through, and several manufacturers did. Agnes has never been consulted about what is in her medication. The bottle is brown glass, and the label reads something suitably medical. She takes it because the alternative has been made clear. She tucks this information away, alongside everything else she is not saying out loud. Let's talk about the crisis. There is always a crisis. In this story, the crisis happens in different rooms, at different times, with different women, and it always looks more or less the same. A woman reaches the limit of what she can manage quietly. Ruth has reached hers. It is a Tuesday, which is statistically the most likely day for things to go wrong, and she has been denied outdoor time for the third consecutive day because the physician has decided that the October air is not advisable for her constitution, and Ruth has opinions about October air and her own constitution that she has expressed, at first politely and then less politely, and the less polite version has been noted in her file as agitation and argumentativeness. Consider increased sedation. Ruth is not dangerous. Ruth is large and loud and has a tremendous laugh and wants to go outside, and she is sitting on her bed in the room she shares with Agnes and Eleanor. And the quality of her stillness is the kind of stillness that comes before weather. Agnes and Eleanor understand this. They have seen it before, not in Ruth specifically, but in versions of it, in themselves and in other women in this ward. This specific compressed fury that has no outlet and no legitimate channel and no good options. You cannot throw a breakfast at a physician in a 19th-century asylum. You cannot sue. You cannot leave. You cannot publish a story about it because you are not allowed a pen. You cannot even be properly angry because being properly angry is what got you here and will keep you here and will justify everything that has been done to you and is being done to you and will be done to you if you let it out. What Ruth does is laugh. After about 15 minutes of that particular stillness, she begins to laugh. The full laugh. The real one. The one that fills a room. At something only she can see. And Agnes and Eleanor watch her. And then Agnes begins to laugh too. And then Eleanor very quietly. And after a while, there is a nurse at the door looking in with the expression of a woman calculating whether she needs to get someone. And the three women are laughing at something that is not funny, which is to say, something that is so completely and utterly unfunny that it has come around the back to funny in the way that only people who understand that particular territory can navigate. The nurse decides this is either harmless or too complicated to address before her shift ends. She leaves. Ruth wipes her eyes. Agnes goes back to her embroidery. Eleanor picks up the paragraph of the book she is memorizing. In the end, this is the crisis. Not a dramatic break. Not a confrontation. A Tuesday in October in which three women who are not ill and are not being cared for laugh together in a room with a too small window, and the laughter does not fix anything, and it does not need to, because some things do not need to be fixed to be real. Outside, or somewhere that feels like outside, Pudding is sniffing at a gate with characteristic investigative optimism. Let's talk about the first cracks in the wall. The 1880s and 1890s are when the story begins, slowly and unevenly, to shift. Not because the medical establishment has seen the error of its ways. That would take longer, and is in some respects still going. But because enough women had enough access to enough education and enough legal standing to begin making noise in venues where noise produced consequences. The women's suffrage movement in Britain escalated dramatically from the 1880s onward. Women who were arrested and imprisoned for suffragette activities and then went on hunger strike were force-fed by prison physicians, which is a profound medical violation and also a demonstration of exactly how far the state would go to maintain physical control of women who would not comply. The force feeding was documented, published, argued over in Parliament, and drew international attention. The women who experienced it were not broken. Many of them spoke publicly about it afterward with a clarity that the medical establishment found distinctly inconvenient. Meanwhile, the germ theory of disease, which had been gaining acceptance since Pasteur's work in the 1860s and Koch's bacteriological discoveries in the 1870s and 1880s, was beginning to make the older explanatory frameworks look less credible. If diseases were caused by specific organisms rather than miasmas, bad air, or constitutional weakness, then perhaps the same kind of specificity could be brought to bear on other medical questions. The shift was slow, contested, and produced as much resistance as acceptance in the short term, but it was creating, within medicine, a culture of evidence that would eventually become incompatible with the older habit of diagnosis by authority. Freud arrived at the end of the century with psychoanalysis, which is a complicated addition to this particular narrative. Psychoanalysis did insist that women's symptoms had psychological causes rather than purely physical ones, which was a step toward taking the inner life seriously. But the specific interpretive framework Freud constructed around female psychology, the famous penis envy, the concept of hysteria as related to repressed sexual trauma, produced its own set of problems in which women's subjective experience of their lives was translated into the vocabulary of a man's theoretical system and then given back to them as explanation. Women who rejected Freudian interpretations of their symptoms were, in this new framework, resisting insight, which is a loop that will feel familiar from the earlier discussion of hysteria and its diagnostic properties. The wall had cracks, is what we are saying. Light was coming through. Not enough yet, and not evenly, and not without cost. But cracks. Let's talk about what survived. This is the chapter that exists outside the consulting room, outside the asylum, outside the curtained room with the nightstand bottle. This is the chapter about what the women in this story did with what they had. Charlotte Perkins Gilman recovered from the rest cure, resumed writing, produced the Yellow Wallpaper, and then 30 more years of essays, novels, social theory, and journalism. She became one of the most prominent feminist intellectuals of the early 20th century. Her work argued, again and again, from different angles, that the conditions of women's lives were the product of social arrangements rather than natural law, and that social arrangements could be changed. Agnes, in her London asylum, eventually gains release. The records are incomplete, the circumstances unclear, but she is noted as discharged in 1884. She returns to something. The records don't say what. Perhaps to the husband, perhaps not. Perhaps to a different life than the one she was brought from. What the records do note, incidentally, is that she asks to take her embroidery with her. The request is granted. Eliza's infant grows up. The cordial bottle empties and is replaced with something else, something age-appropriate, because the infant grows and the colic passes, and the particular crisis of that specific night becomes one of many nights in a life that contains many nights and does not consist entirely of them. Eliza finds things easier, later, when she knows more. She does not find out what was in the cordial until much later, and when she does, she says nothing about it. In the way of someone who has processed an uncomfortable fact and decided that silence is the useful response. This is not ignorance. This is another kind of management. Ruth gets out of the asylum in 1885. Eleanor gets out a year before that. Ruth does not return to the husband who had her committed because that husband has had, in the intervening time, an encounter with the logic of his own situation. Specifically, the loss of several business dealings and a significant portion of the social standing that made the commitment seem like a reasonable move, and is now less interested in managing Ruth and more interested in managing his own affairs. Ruth is not sorry to be free. she is also not sorry for the experiences of 1882 to 1885, which she regards as, if nothing else, educational. She has met people she would not have otherwise met. She has discovered depths in herself she didn't previously know about. She has Ruth. Ruth says to Eleanor at parting, "No complaints about Ruth." Eleanor writes, eventually, "Not for publication. Not then. Not for a long time." But she writes in notebooks that she keeps first in one place and then in another, and the writing is extraordinary, precise, darkly funny, relentlessly observant, full of the specific quality of attention that comes from years of having nothing to do but watch. She writes about what she saw. She names no names. She describes systems with the cool accuracy of someone who has had a great deal of time to study them. No one publishes it until long after she is gone. But it exists. That is, in this story, a kind of triumph. Let's not forget the aftermath, because the story doesn't end in the 19th century. The specific diagnoses changed names, but the basic dynamic, the tendency to interpret women's distress as pathology rather than as a rational response to circumstances, had considerable momentum and a long 20th century to run in. Shell shock in the First World War was the moment when the medical establishment had to reckon with the fact that extreme stress could produce what it had previously called hysteria in soldiers. The response was mixed. Some physicians recognized the parallel and found it revelatory. Others managed to hold simultaneously the view that shell shock in men was understandable and that the same symptoms in women were constitutional. The vocabulary shifted anyway. Neurasthenia faded. Hysteria faded. New categories arrived. Tranquilizers, specifically the benzodiazepines, which arrived in the late 1950s with Librium and then with Valium in 1963, produced a new chapter in the story with an efficiency that the 19th century would have admired. Valium was marketed heavily to physicians, and the advertisements in medical journals are, from this historical vantage point, extraordinary. Women shown as anxious, overwhelmed, difficult, contained within the frame of the domestic, with the drug positioned as the solution to what the advertisements sometimes called, simply, the problem that has no name, which was also the phrase Betty Friedan used in 1963 to describe something else entirely, and the coincidence of timing is either ironic or just the 20th century being the 20th century. By the early 1970s, Valium was the most widely prescribed drug in the United States, and twice as many prescriptions were written for women as for men, not because women had twice as many anxiety disorders, because the medical habit of treating women's distress primarily as a symptom to be sedated rather than a signal to be heard was not entirely gone. It was just wearing different clothes, writing new prescriptions, sitting across from a slightly smaller chair. The questions that Mary Putnam Jacobi asked in 1876, and Elizabeth Blackwell before her, and the suffragettes after them, and Betty Friedan in 1963, and the feminist health movement of the 1970s, these questions eventually accumulated enough force to produce real changes in medical education, in research methodology, in the legal standing of patients, in the treatment of psychiatric symptoms in women, in the emerging field of women's health that insisted women's bodies required specific study rather than being treated as smaller, more troublesome versions of men's bodies. These changes were not complete, They are not complete now. But they happened. And they happened because a very large number of people, mostly women, kept asking questions in rooms where the furniture was arranged to make them feel small. Welcome to the aftermath. It is ongoing. Progress is sometimes hard to see when you're inside it. Let's talk about what we owe them. This is the chapter that steps back, that takes a breath, that tries to see the whole thing at once. The women in this story were not victims in the passive sense, not objects who had things done to them and nothing else. They were people in conditions of severe constraint who made decisions within those constraints that demonstrated, repeatedly, the qualities that the medical system officially denied them: intelligence, wit, strategic thinking, emotional sophistication, courage, and a stubborn, occasionally furious, ultimately undestroyable commitment to their own inner lives. Agnes did her embroidery because it was something she could control, could make, could carry out of the institution as evidence that she had been there and had made something while she was there. Ruth made community because community was the resource available to her. Charlotte wrote because writing was the only form of autonomy left to her, and she wrote specifically to say so, and she said it clearly enough that it is still being read. Eliza kept going because that is also a thing that people do, and it should be counted. And the physicians, even Hartwell, even Mitchell, deserve a sentence that tries to be fair. They were inside a system too. They had been taught what they knew by people who were teaching what they had been taught, in a chain that goes back far enough that identifying a single point of malice is impossible. Most of them believed they were helping. Most of them were wrong. The belief and the wrongness coexisted, which is a thing that happens in human beings and is not a contradiction. And the history of medicine is full of it. The lesson is not that doctors are wicked. The lesson is that systems produce outcomes regardless of the intentions of the people inside them, and that examining the outcomes is more useful than examining the intentions. That lesson is still being learned. It will keep being learned. This is, in some respects, what history is for. Outside, or somewhere very like outside, Pudding is sleeping in a patch of whatever light has made it through the curtain. She is warm. She has eaten. She is entirely unconcerned with the history of medicine, which is, in its way, a form of grace. Let's talk about the small dignities. In every historical chapter that involves systematic cruelty or systematic control, there are small things, small, warm things that survive, not because they are heroic, but because they are human, and human beings, in the absence of other options, find their dignity in small things with considerable persistence. The women in the Salpêtrière grew flowers. The records note that the courtyard had flower beds that were maintained by patients. This is documented as therapeutic activity. What the women were actually doing, when they were doing it, was growing something. Charlotte, in her curtained room, memorized the patterns of the wallpaper. She gave the patterns names privately and tracked their movement with scientific attention. This is what the story is about, ostensibly, the creeping horror of the wallpaper. But it is also about what a very capable mind does when everything else has been taken away. It works. It observes. It classifies and records and generates meaning. The wallpaper is also just a very intelligent person refusing to stop thinking. Agnes's embroidery has a pattern. It is geometric. It is careful. It is small and intricate, and she carries it out of the institution in a cloth bag that the nursing staff inspected before allowing her to take it. They were looking for contraband. They found embroidery. Neither of them knows what exactly the other one is thinking, but one of them is satisfied, and one of them is hiding something with excellent craft in plain sight. Ruth's laugh, Eleanor's notebooks, Eliza's continuing competent management of a life that gave her very little to work with. These are not dramatic actions. They don't involve storming barricades or publishing manifestos. They are the everyday version of the thing that the suffragettes and the medical reformers and the legal campaigners were also doing, at greater volume and at different scales. The insistence that the person inside the frame is a person, and that personhood does not require external permission, and that it cannot be legislated or medicated or embroidered away. Here is the small truth that this whole long history keeps returning to. The system was very thorough, and it had all the weight of science and law and social consensus behind it, and it was wrong. And the women it was designed to manage were right. Not about everything. No one is right about everything. But about the fundamental question of whether they were people. They were right about that. They were right about it all along, in every room they were put in, whether they said it loudly or quietly or sideways through embroidery. They were right, and they mostly stayed right. And eventually, the world slowly, reluctantly, unevenly began to catch up with them. That is, all things considered, a fairly good outcome for a story that spends a lot of time in curtained rooms, smelling of laudanum and coal smoke. Let's talk about the women who practiced medicine anyway. Because the history of women being medicated into compliance exists alongside, and this is a detail the official story has a habit of omitting, a long, persistent history of women practicing medicine informally, self-organizing healthcare, and doing, in the margins of the official system, what the official system said they were constitutionally unfit to do. The midwife is the oldest version of this. For most of recorded history, and in most of the world, childbirth was managed by women. The lying-in chamber was a women's space. The attending figures were female. The knowledge was transmitted through female lineages. The authority was embodied in women who had attended hundreds of births and accumulated the kind of expertise that comes only from presence and practice. The professionalization of obstetrics in the 18th and 19th centuries, the entry of male physicians into the birth room, armed with forceps and the authority of formal credentials, began a long displacement of this expertise, which was reframed as superstition, as folk knowledge, as the well-meaning but scientifically unsound practice of uneducated women. The forceps, which could save lives when used correctly and cause serious damage when used incorrectly, became a symbol of this transition. A new technology wielded by credentialed men who had never given birth, applied to a process that women had been managing for a very long time, with their hands and their knowledge and their presence. This is not to say midwifery was always safe. It wasn't, and nothing in the pre-antibiotic, pre-germ theory era was safe in the way we now understand safety. It is to say that the displacement of female medical expertise was not purely about improving outcomes. It was also about authority and credentials and the meaning of the word professional and who got to be one. In the herb garden and the kitchen, the practice continued regardless. Pennyroyal for the regulation of menstruation, which is also an abortifacient at higher doses, and which women have known about since antiquity, and which appears in herbals and recipe books and kitchen notes throughout this entire period, under various names, mentioned in ways that make clear the writer knows what she is writing about and expects the reader to know what she is reading. Ergot for postpartum hemorrhage, chamomile for pain, valerian for sleep, raspberry leaf for pregnancy. Some of these work, some don't. The point is not the pharmacological efficacy. The point is the knowledge itself, maintained, transmitted, used, and entirely invisible to the official medical record, because it was managed without consultation, without prescription, and without a man in the room. The women practicing this informal pharmacy were also, in their way, doing what Agnes was doing with her embroidery, maintaining something that the system hadn't quite managed to touch, keeping it precise, keeping it useful, passing it quietly to the next person who needed it. Agnes's embroidery goes with her when she leaves. The herbalist's knowledge goes with her granddaughter and the granddaughter's daughter, and forward into time in the specific form that all genuinely practical knowledge takes when it has nowhere official to live. It becomes conversation. It becomes recipe. It becomes the kind of thing that someone knows without being entirely sure how they know it, which is the most durable form of information there is. Ruth, who is practical above all things, has a specific arrangement with a woman in her neighborhood who knows things about herbs and timing that are not in any of the medical textbooks. And Ruth does not discuss this with her physician, and her physician does not ask. And this mutual silence is, in its way, a negotiation that produces something that could almost be called an accommodation. It is not equality. It is not justice. It is the thing that people do when justice is not available, and they are not willing to simply wait for it. They find the route around. The route around. Women's informal medical knowledge, the midwife's hands, the herbalist's garden, the recipe that appears in a cookery book between the preserved fruits and the instructions for removing ink stains. These are the underground river of this whole history, running beneath everything, keeping things alive, waiting for the moment when the official channels catch up. Let's talk about the survival observation. Let's take a step back from the curtained rooms and the consulting rooms and the asylums and the brown glass bottles, and simply look at the people who are inside all of this and say clearly, they were tougher than us, not in an abstract, sentimental way, in a specific, evidenced way that the facts of this history bear out at every point. They were tougher because they had no antibiotics and survived infection rates that would constitute a public health emergency by any contemporary standard. They were tougher because their food was frequently adulterated, their water was frequently contaminated, their air in industrial cities was genuinely toxic with coal particulates, and they built lives in it anyway. They were tougher because the remedies available to them for serious illness were often more dangerous than the illness. Arsenic for anemia, mercury for infections, antimony for fever, and they took them because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was rarely the better option. And specifically, the women of this history were tough in the way that only people working against a sustained institutional headwind can be, with the particular muscle that comes from having to fight for things that other people simply have. The women who campaigned for education, for property rights, for the vote, for recognition within medicine, for the basic legal acknowledgement that they were competent to manage their own affairs, were doing all of this while simultaneously managing houses, raising children, navigating marriages, coping with unregulated drugs, and finding, in the margins of all of it, the time and energy and conviction to keep pushing. Agnes kept a precise account in her head of every relevant fact about her case, because she understood from the beginning that knowledge was the only form of power available to her, and she did not waste it. Charlotte wrote while she was supposedly too unwell to write, and the writing she produced in and after the worst years of her life is some of the most important social criticism of the century. Ruth maintained her sense of humor in an institution specifically designed to reduce her personhood, because humor is, among other things, a form of defiance that doesn't require resources. These are not small things. These are the kinds of strengths that tend to get dismissed in historical accounts because they don't produce visible monuments, no plaques, no portraits, no grand official moments. They produce instead an unbroken thread of human resistance that runs through the official history like the underground river we were just discussing, visible only if you know to look, but real and continuous, and carrying something forward that the official story would have preferred to let go. The physician in his large chair believes that he understands the patient in the small chair. He has a frame for understanding her, a very detailed, very credentialed, very elaborately theorized frame, and he places her inside it with considerable confidence. What he cannot quite account for is the woman looking at him from inside the frame, who is also framing him, noting his assumptions, assessing his certainty, calculating the gap between what he knows and what he thinks he knows, and deciding, quietly and precisely, what to do about it. Agnes is doing this right now. She has always been doing this. She is very good at it. And here is the last thing this history is asking us to notice. The women who were told, by the full authority of Victorian medicine and law and social convention, that they were too emotional, too irrational, too constitutionally unstable to be trusted with their own minds and lives and money and votes. These women were right more often than the people managing them on the fundamental questions this history was actually about. Not the medical theories, but the question of what a human being is and what a human being is owed. The women in the small chairs were right. They were right all along, and they knew it, which is perhaps the most extraordinary part. They stayed right in rooms specifically designed to make being right feel impossible, patiently, creatively, collectively, in small stitches and low voices and full laughs, until enough of the world had caught up to make the rightness visible. Welcome to the survival observation. They were tougher than the century they were born into. They survived it. They shaped what came after. And that is, in any accounting, a significant thing to have done. So here you are, still breathing, still warm, having spent the last several hours somewhere in the 1870s and 1880s, sitting in smaller chairs and smaller rooms, taking the long way through one of the most quietly extraordinary chapters in the history of medicine and the history of being a person who was told, repeatedly, by people with impressive furniture, that they were not quite a person. You sat in Dr. Hartwell's consulting room and held a piece of paper. You took the prescribed tincture and the prescribed quiet and the prescribed absence of intellectual life. You spent time in the curtained room and memorized the wallpaper. You embroidered with Agnes and laughed with Ruth and read quietly with Eleanor. You measured Godfrey's cordial and tried not to think about what was in it. You were in the room when the physicians conferred and when the records were made, and when the system went about its efficient business of deciding what you needed without asking you anything at all. It was cold a lot of the time. It was dim. It smelled of things you would rather not smell of, and the food was variable in quality and fixed in quantity, and the bottle on the nightstand was always there with its brown glass and its sweet medicinal promise. And yet, and this word keeps earning its place in this story, it was also full of people who were, despite everything, themselves, who embroidered and laughed and memorized wallpaper and grew flowers in the courtyard and hid extraordinary minds in plain sight and kept being right about the most important question, even when everyone with a prescription pad told them they were wrong. The real people this episode was built around the Charlottes and the Agneses and the Ruths and the Elizas and the Eleanor who wrote in notebooks were not waiting to be rescued. They were not passive objects of history. They were living their lives inside conditions most of us, in our most honest moments, would find unbearable. And they were doing so with resources, intelligence, humor, community, craft, that no prescription could quite reach. They were tougher than the century they were born into gave them credit for. They were smarter than it intended them to be. They found each other in curtained rooms and asylum wards and common spaces, and they made something together that the medical establishment had neither prescribed nor accounted for. They were also funny, which history forgets. Agnes's dry eyes, Ruth's full laugh, Charlotte's specific literary fury, delivered in precise, devastating prose. These were not humorless people enduring a humorless time. They were people who understood, on some level, that dark material requires a light touch, and that the light touch is its own kind of dignity. Now look at where you are. You are in a bed that is yours. The mattress beneath you was chosen by you, or at least tolerated by you, which is a form of agency. And the sheets are clean, and nothing is trying to cure you of anything. No one has written a prescription for your opinions. No one has concluded that your dissatisfaction is a symptom of your constitution, rather than a rational assessment of your circumstances. No one is managing the amount of light in your room, or the amount of food on your plate, or the number of books you are allowed to read, or the number of thoughts you are allowed to have before it becomes medically inadvisable. You have central heating. You have clean water and indoor plumbing, and lights that turn on and off at your command. You have, and this one is worth sitting with, the right to exist as your own authority on what you are feeling, what you need, and who you are. These things were not given willingly. They were argued for, and legislated for, and published for, and in some cases bled for, by people who spent a lot of time in small chairs in front of large desks, And here they are, yours, in the dark. There is something in all of this about how change happens, not in great lurching moments of dramatic revelation, but in small, persistent accumulations of people who are being right consistently enough, for long enough, that eventually, even the people with the large desks have to notice. Agnes's embroidery, Charlotte's story, Eleanor's notebook, Ruth's laugh. These are not footnotes to history. They are the mechanism of it. They are how it actually works, underneath all the legislation and the published papers and the framed certificates on dark green walls. And now, because this is where you are, in the dark, in your bed, and the historical world is receding like something at a pleasant distance, let it go. Let the consulting rooms and the curtained rooms and the small chairs all become what history always becomes. The back half of the view from where you're standing, far enough to see clearly, far enough to feel the particular gratitude that comes from knowing how different it could have been, how recently it was. Close your eyes. You are in your room. It smells of whatever your room smells of. Nothing medicinal, nothing sweet in that particular way. The fan is on if you need it. The dark is comfortable. No one is going to write anything down. No one is waiting outside your door with a prescription for something you don't need. You are, tonight, the sole authority on your own experience. You have been this, your entire life, without perhaps having had occasion to note it. You have it noted now. Agnes, somewhere back there, is finishing a row of embroidery. Ruth is probably laughing about something. Charlotte is writing. Pudding is asleep, warm and unconcerned, as all the best creatures are. Sleep well. You have earned the quiet.